Quick note before we get started, this video took 3 days to watch, to research, and to edit. When you watch 1 minute of video, it takes about an hour to edit that video. I'm shooting this on Sunday night when I am just about done. So please enjoy this video, and if you can, head over to ryanmcbeth.substack.com. Toss me $5 if you got it. Let's watch the video. On Thursday, January 30th, 2025, former U.S. Representative and presidential candidate Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard was interviewed by the Senate Intelligence Committee to be the Director of National Intelligence for the Trump administration. I watched the entire hearing and took copious notes so you wouldn't have to, and I had some thoughts. If you just want to skip to my analysis of the hearings, skip to this time up here. First off, special thanks to my Substack subscribers. It is because of you and your $5 every month that I can do this sort of work. Us YouTubers are famous, not rich. Quick note for my foreign viewers. In the United States, the president picks his cabinet choices, and 21 of them must be confirmed by the Senate, which is the upper house of the U.S. Congress. Now, it used to be that this process was kind of rubber stamped with notable exceptions. For example, in 1833, the Senate rejected President Andrew Jackson's choice for Secretary of the Treasury, Roger B. Taney. And in 1925, a coalition of Senate Democrats and even some Republicans twice defeated President Coolidge's nominee for Attorney General, Charles V. Waring, because of his ties to the Sugar Trust. But typically, about 95% of the president's nominees get confirmed. Usually the Senate is more concerned about getting on with the business of the country rather than grandstanding and securing political points on TV. Now, Colonel Gabbard was nominated for Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, something that is called ODNI, or Office of the Director of National Intelligence, on occasion. This is a position that was created after the 9/11 attacks because the U.S. had a number of intelligence agencies that each had their own clues about the hijackers, but they weren't really sharing information or had no way of doing so. It's actually a little more complex than that, but that would be a topic for a whole different video. Now, DNI ties together something like 18 agencies and about $100 billion in budgeting. The director requires an extensive national security background. The first director was John Negroponte, who was a United States Foreign Service veteran. The second director, Admiral Mike McConnell, was a naval intelligence officer. Admiral Dennis Blair was the associate director of Central Intelligence for military support. I could keep going, but if you want to read the full list of names and biographies, it's available for free at ryanmcbeth.substack.com. Now, on to Colonel Gabbard's resume. Colonel Gabbard is a pretty unique person. She's from Hawaii. She's of Samoan and European ancestry. She's a Hindu. She served as a medic in the Army National Guard in Hawaii, eventually went to officer training. Again, for my foreign viewers, the National Guard is sort of a hybrid state militia force that can deploy overseas to combat if necessary, and she did deploy multiple times. Eventually, she ran a military police platoon and later a civil affairs unit as a battalion commander in both the Guard and the Army Reserves. While doing all this, she served in the Hawaii House of Representatives, the Honolulu City Council, and was eventually elected to the United States House of Representatives. While serving as a representative, she attempted to run for president in 2020. She identified her political affiliation as Democrat for most of those years, although she recently changed her party affiliation to Republican. Now, a person who is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, Guard or Reserves, will have access to sensitive information. They will have a security clearance, most likely a top secret clearance. But unless they are in an intelligence unit, they are mainly an intelligence consumer. It's a lot like watching movies. You can develop a deep appreciation for film. You can recognize good storytelling, cinematography, direction, but that doesn't mean you can step onto a set and direct like Quentin Tarantino. Watching movies isn't the same as making them. And in the same way, reading intelligence briefings isn't the same as collecting, analyzing, and producing intelligence. And keep in mind, the Director of National Intelligence is the person who briefs the President of the United States every single day on threats facing the United States. You want the best person for the job there. So while watching this video, I want you to ask yourself, is Colonel Gabbard the best person for the job? Now, the hearing starts off in the Dickinson office building. A lot of people think that the business of Congress happens here at the Capitol, and it does, but the real work goes on in these office buildings that are outside of the Capitol. The committee meeting starts with Senator Tom Cotton, who is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And one thing to note is that at one point, Tom Cotton says,
Hillary Clinton has smeared Miss Gabbard, calling her an asset of a foreign nation.
Now, Colonel Gabbard has had at least 5 FBI background checks to acquire and maintain her security clearance as an Army officer. The notion of her being an asset in the sense of a paid mouthpiece of Russia is absurd on its face. But the troubling part about Colonel Gabbard is that she has frequently engaged in behavior that has either parroted Russian talking points or has been used by Russia to further their own propaganda goals. For example, in March of 2022, she tweeted a video saying there were biological laboratories in Ukraine that, if breached, could spread deadly pathogens. At the time, a Russian ambassador to the United Nations accused Ukraine of operating a US-funded military biological activities in Ukraine. Now, at no time did Colonel Gabbard ever say biological weapons, but the average person doesn't know the difference. And this is kind of how Russian propaganda works. There's 3 phases: seeding, harvesting, amplification. In the seeding phase, they spread propaganda like US-funded bioweapons labs. In the harvesting phase, they see what works, and then they use their network of bots and sophists to amplify the message. The ultimate goal is to have someone in the West, preferably a prominent media figure, a journalist, repeat what they said, because then it lends credibility to their propaganda message. But the question here is one of judgment. When you make a video like this so close to Russia's accusations, you're doing it for a reason. Either you think Ukraine really is working on biological agents and you're just leaving out the word weapons, kind of gives you top cover in case you're wrong, or you know it's not true and you're appealing to your base as an iconoclast in order to jump on a trending topic. It's one of those 2 things, and both of them are bad. But since Russia never listed inspections of biological laboratories on their original ceasefire demands, that's a pretty good indicator that they were pushing bioweapon propaganda. So while the idea of Colonel Gabbard being a paid Russian asset is absurd on its face, you can see why some people might say asset in the sense that she has a platform of 3.5 million followers and tends to say things that align with Russian talking points for reasons that are only known to her. Now let's fast forward to 15 minutes in, where Senator Mark Warner says,
I continue to have significant concerns about your judgment and your qualifications to meet the standards set by law.
And when you look at all the people who previously served in that appointed role, every single one was a producer of intelligence as opposed to a consumer. Now, that being said, nobody, including Colonel Gabbard, gets up in the morning wanting to do a bad job. Nobody says, boy, I hope I get this brief wrong. I hope the president makes a mistake and he makes a bad decision on the information I gave him. Nobody does that. But does the colonel meet the standard of the previous appointees? Then Senator Warren says,
There's no legal requirement that our allies share intelligence with us. It's all predicated on trust. Trust that our allies will protect each other's secrets. It appears to me you have repeatedly excused our adversaries' worst actions, and instead often blamed them on the United States and those very allies.
I think this can be demonstrated in her own words, where she said in a tweet, this war and suffering could have easily been avoided if the Biden administration / NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, which would mean the US / NATO forces right on Russia's border. And this itself is a Russian narrative. The fact is that any nation can agree to enter into an alliance with any other nation. That is one of the rights of nationhood. And Russia already has NATO on its borders, specifically Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Yes, this little part of Kaliningrad is Russian, annexed by the Soviet Union after World War II. And in a lot of ways, Russia only has itself to blame for Ukraine leaning westward, and here's why. Pre-2014, it would be helpful to think of Ukraine as kind of like Ireland, where many Ukrainians west of the Dnieper River were kind of like the Irish Catholics who wanted to be free to choose their own fate, and pro-Russians were the Protestants that were kind of east of the Dnieper River who were still loyal to the crown. So pro-Russians tended to be in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. When Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014, it suddenly took a massive amount of pro-Russian Ukrainian voters off the table, making it easier for pro-Western candidates to run for office. I mean, if this part of California split off and became its own country, how would it influence American elections? And if Russia was so afraid of NATO operations on their borders, they sure did a poor job of preventing it, because 2 more countries, Finland and Sweden, joined NATO after Russia attacked. And Finland is on the Russian border. Look, the fact is that Russia invaded Ukraine because this is phase 1 of a 3-phase plan to eventually take the Baltics and then Poland. So you take this giant indefensible border and you shrink it down to like 150, 200 miles. Now then, Senator Warner says,
now, I don't know if your intent in making those statements was to defend those dictators, or if you were simply unaware of the intelligence and how your statements would be perceived.
and he's not wrong. Colonel Gabbard is a frequent guest on podcasts where she has repeated Russian propaganda. One of those incidents was an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast number 2143, where she claimed that survivors of the Maui wildfires were only getting a one-time payment from the government of $700.
And someone asked the question, what are you, FEMA, what are you actually doing for the people who've been impacted by this tragedy? And the director stood there with a straight face and proudly said, well, we have provided a one-time payment of $700 to everyone who has been impacted by this fire or displaced by this fire. And
$700 was issued by FEMA, which is America's disaster management agency. It's what's called critical needs assistance. It's where you get an immediate payment to buy new clothes or medications. Then you come back the next day and you apply for your actual aid. This misinformation was so bad that FEMA actually had to address this rumor. And the reason this misinformation spread is that the wildfire just so happened to coincide with a congressional visit to Ukraine, and Russia really wanted to push that narrative that the U.S. was funding Ukraine at the expense of Hawaii disaster relief. You can see some of that evidence for this collected by Professor Carolyn Orbueno, who did an amazing job in her Substack article on the subject of tracking the phrase Hawaii, not Ukraine. You can find that on my Substack. But the issue here is that if foreign governments know that Colonel Gabbard tends to amplify Russian narratives, why on earth would foreign governments tell the U.S. anything? Why would they give the U.S. intelligence that they have? If you have a friend who gossips a lot, sooner or later you stop inviting them out to dinner. Then Senator Warner starts talking about Edward Snowden.
You have been publicly outspoken in your praise and defense of Edward Snowden.
Quick note, I am not an Edward Snowden fan. In fact, he even blocked me on Twitter because I correctly pointed out that he is nothing more than a low-level SharePoint administrator and not a cybersecurity expert. Now, I actually read Edward Snowden's autobiography. Essentially, he was a government contractor who downloaded a bunch of files onto a thumb drive. He fled to China, he handed the data over to journalists, and later fled to Russia. And his rationale for doing this was that the U.S. may have been doing some illegal mass surveillance. And the issue with this is kind of twofold. Number one, there are methods in place to go through appropriate channels if you think the government is breaking the law. Number two, some of the surveillance techniques that were revealed in this data that was collected and released by Edward Snowden allowed terrorists to alter their behavior in order to avoid data collection. People who don't like Edward Snowden call him a traitor. People who do like him call him a hero. But the senator was right when he said,
Might I add, had nothing to do with Americans' privacy, and compromised our most important sources and methods. And in many ways, we're still paying a price for that. And I believe that Edward Snowden's action put our men and women in uniform in places like Iraq and Afghanistan at risk.
This kind of kicks off a point where I believe that Edward Snowden is mentioned at least 62 times, at least by counting in the transcript. At one point, I wondered if Edward Snowden was actually being confirmed, not Colonel Gabbard. What's kind of funny here is that Edward Snowden was actually watching the hearing and tweeting about it. Now then, Senator Warner brings up FISA 702.
Not only did you vote against reauthorizing 702, you actually introduced legislation to fully repeal the whole thing.
FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This was passed in 1978, which allows the U.S. government to collect foreign intelligence information. If you want to read about it, you can find the basic explanation as a PDF at ryanmcbeth.substack.com. Now, 702 was a provision passed by Congress in 2008 designed to modernize FISA in order to keep it up with technology changes since 1978. One of the original issues with the law is that it allows the United States government, under some circumstances, to gather information about Americans who've been communicating with foreigners. And believe it or not, it is totally cool to do that if you have a warrant. In the United States, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. You need probable cause. You need a list of specific places and things to be searched. And in some circumstances, like a ticking time bomb scenario, the government can monitor the communications of Americans without a warrant if it would hamper the speed and efficiency of operations and impair their ability to identify threats to America. The problem is that
702 is critical to our national security. 60% of the president's daily brief, 60% of the information President Trump gets every day in the PDB will come from this.
And remember, the job of Director of National Intelligence is to give the president's daily brief. And if you don't believe in one of the laws that gives you the power to collect 60% of the intelligence for the president's daily brief, that could be a problem. In this case, Colonel Gabbard had personal reservations about 702 on Fourth Amendment grounds to the point where she actually introduced a bill to repeal it. Now, since then, she said she has a change in heart about 702, and people change, especially as they mature or gain access to information they didn't have before. But it seems like most members of Congress from both parties during the hearing, they're trying to figure out if this change was one of conviction or of convenience. I watched the whole thing, and I can tell you that I don't know. Now, at this point, I want to point out that during the hearings, U.S. Senator Richard Burr, who helped introduce Colonel Gabbard, testified saying that
I was contacted by several national journalists shortly after the president nominated Tulsi, asking me to confirm one of the many rumors circulating about this nominee. I informed each journalist over a 5-week period that the rumors shared with me was simply not true.
Now, I don't know if it's coordinated, but the Wall Street Journal ran an article about how Colonel Gabbard paid a public relations firm to suppress coverage of the pyramid scheme involved with her Hindu sect. Now, Article 6 of the Constitution states that no religious tests should be required to hold any office or public trust. Considering that my family is in America instead of Northern Ireland, when people start whipping out religion as a reason not to hire someone in government, that kind of rubs me wrong. And in the same way that Hillary Clinton dismissed Colonel Gabbard as a Russian asset, there does appear to be some sort of ham-fisted attempt at establishing Colonel Gabbard as some kind of Hindu cultist or something, and that's messed up. You don't do that in America. In fact, you come here because religion doesn't matter. At 35 minutes in, Colonel Gabbard speaks. And one interesting thing is that she mentions Syria and Al-Qaeda.
I just hate Al-Qaeda. I hate that we have leaders who cozy up to Islamist extremists, minimizing them to so-called rebels. As Jake Sullivan said to Hillary Clinton, quote, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Well, Syria is now controlled by an Al-Qaeda offshoot, HTS, led by an Islamist jihadist who danced in the streets on 9/11 and who was responsible for the killing of many American service members.
So there is some controversy with Colonel Gabbard and Syria. The colonel traveled to Syria in 2017 to meet with then Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Since then, the government of Syria has fallen, and the dominant faction in charge seems to be this Islamist militant militia group called HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The leader of HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Jawani, was a member of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was even captured and detained in an American prison for about 5 years. Now, a couple of things. It seems like HTS hasn't implemented Sharia law or persecuted Christians, Druze, and Alawites. Now, the new Syrian constitution hasn't been written yet, and the rights of the people haven't really been defined. I am cautiously optimistic that the new constitution will be Islamic in nature, but still protect the rights of minorities. And the reason I say that is that HTS is open to integrating the Kurdish leaders of the Syrian Democratic Forces into the National Army. And so, in much the same way that Colonel Gabbard evolved in her opinion of FISA 702, or at least had a conversion of convenience, if not conviction, could HTS have had the same epiphany? I find it possible, and many people I know who follow Syria are cautiously optimistic, as am I. Now, let's get back to Edward Snowden again with Senator Warner saying,
But Edward Snowden isn't a whistleblower. And in this case, I'm a lot closer to the chairman's words, where he said Snowden is, quote, an egotistical serial liar and traitor who, quote, deserves to rot in jail for the rest of his life.
To which Colonel Gabbard replies,
Now, Mr. Vice Chairman, Edward Snowden broke the law.
and that's pretty much the best we're going to get. She repeats this a number of times.
Edward Snowden broke the law. Edward Snowden broke the law. Edward Snowden broke the law. There's no question about that.
Now back to FISA 702. At one point, Senator Warren says,
You went on Joe Rogan's podcast in May. The bill is now law. And you said, quote, this bill took an already bad problem and made it many, many times worse.
And that's kind of the problem with Colonel Gabbard and social media in general. I've said before that Joe Rogan will never invite me on his podcast. And there's reasons for this. I am not popular enough and I am not controversial. A podcast is a business. You want controversial guests who will talk about how the government has secret programs that stomp on your rights because that's what gets eyeballs and ear holes. And one of the reasons I think that the Wall Street Journal article was such a low blow was that they're trying to kind of smear Colonel Gabbard based on her affiliation with this Hindu sect. But if you want the real Tulsi Gabbard, watch your appearances on podcasts. When somebody tells you who they are, believe them. Now, around 1 hour in, Senator Susan Collins of Maine asks,
do you still support providing individuals who have access to top secret information with the ability to make their own decisions regarding whether that information should be publicly disclosed, even though disclosure may cause tremendous harm to our country or our allies?
And the Colonel's response is,
Senator, we cannot and should not have individual vigilantes within the intelligence community making their own decisions about how and where and when to expose our nation's secrets.
that's a good answer. It's the answer I would certainly want to hear. Then Senator Ron Wyden asks,
Section 702 also involves a huge loophole now that was included recently that could allow the government to force anyone with access to a Wi-Fi router or cable box to secretly participate in the warrantless surveillance program. Do you support, as I do, eliminating this language?
Senator, I would have to look more into that and assess, if confirmed, what the impacts of the implementation of the existing safeguards are and come back to you in Congress as you look at reauthorization.
Now, some people made fun of Colonel Gabbard because she didn't know about this, implying she didn't know about the actual text of 702. But what she gave there was a very solid Army officer answer. She doesn't try to BS her way through it. She essentially says, I don't know, but I will find out. That is what an Army officer is supposed to say when they encounter something they don't know. Now, yes, she probably should have studied more because she probably should know. But the answer she gave isn't a bad answer. Then Senator John Cornyn asks regarding 702 and warrants.
What would be necessary to be shown in order to establish probable cause to a judge in order to obtain a warrant?
To which the Colonel replies,
That this is the center of the debate, the high standard of probable cause that's required to get a warrant, and why this will continue to be a conversation, again, with the Attorney General weighing in and all of you in Congress making this policy decision.
and it's a kind of interesting question because Colonel Gabbard is not a lawyer, so she might not even be able to define what probable cause is. Now, she will have lawyers who figure that out if she becomes DNI, but it's probably something she should have known coming in. Then Senator Morton Heinrich of New Mexico asks,
who do you blame? Who's responsible for the war in Ukraine?
Putin started the war in Ukraine.
Now that is the correct answer, but it directly contradicts her tweet on February 23rd. And then on October 18th of 2024, she went on conservative podcaster's Charlie Kirk's show and said,
we look at the Democrat Party of today, and it hurts when I really think about this, that it was once the party of peace, for example. There is not a single Democrat in Congress today who has voted against or spoken out against continuously sending hundreds of millions of our taxpayer dollars, over $1 billion at this point, to continue this proxy war against Russia via Ukraine, using the Ukrainian people's lives in what is a regime change war against Russia.
So I'm kind of confused. Did Putin start the war and we're trying to provide aid to a budding democracy, or did the United States start a proxy war with Russia? Because one of these opinions gets you on Charlie Kirk and the other doesn't. Now, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. Then Senator Jerry Warren says,
when you talk about Russia, what are your fears or policy priorities beyond ending the war? How do you see Russia as a threat to the United States?
Senator, if confirmed as the Director of National Intelligence, it will be paramount for me to assess where our intelligence gaps may exist so that I can provide the President and all of you with the most accurate full picture of that threat assessment to directly answer your questions.
And that isn't an answer. This is kind of the part where being a good podcast guest instead of being a good policy person kind of comes back to bite her. Because anybody in the intelligence community will tell you that it is vital to support Ukraine because, number one, Russia will not stop Ukraine. They have to take the Baltics, they have to take Poland to complete their plan. And number two, standing with Ukraine deters China from attacking Taiwan. Because if we won't support a country that has a rail network connecting through Europe, we're not all of a sudden going to see the light and we have to move supplies 6,100 miles across an ocean. And if you are watching this video on a device with a microchip, you should want a free Taiwan. Yes, the US is investing in domestic computer chip fabrication. It is years away from chip independence. Now, a lot of hay has been made about the next line from Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado.
Was Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America?
Senator, I will also repeat my answer. He broke the law.
Now, what's interesting here is that there are quite a few people on the Intelligence Committee who believe that Snowden is a traitor. That being said, there have been rumors that the Trump administration has been considering a pardon, although President Trump didn't act back in 2020 when this was an option, and I think this kind of put the colonel in a weird position because it was President Trump who nominated her. And if she doesn't know the president's position, why would she state hers? So what she's doing is sensible and rational, at least from the standpoint of the candidate for the cabinet. Then Senator Bennet asked a question regarding Colonel Gabbard's tweets and podcast appearances. And I'm just going to play the whole exchange in its entirety.
Are you aware that your comments about proxy wars and Russia's legitimate security concerns, to quote your own words, are in alignment with what the Russians have said to justify their invasion of Ukraine? Yes or no?
Senator, I don't pay attention to Russian propaganda. My goal is to speak the truth, regardless of whether you like it or not.
I'll take it. That's fine. You said you are used to speaking truth to power.
Yes.
I'm shocked to hear you now say that, you are agreeing. I'm not shocked because I know you said it. You are agreeing that you basically said that Putin was justified in rolling over the peaceful border of Ukraine the first time since World War II.
Later on in the questioning, Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona asked Colonel Gabbard if she believes that Bashar al-Assad was responsible for chemical attacks against his own people. And this actual issue is a little complex. It could be a video on its own, but essentially it was regarding two specific chemical attacks. I'm just going to play the whole thing.
Can you explain to me then why you doubted the intelligence community's conclusions in these two cases, Duma and Kanche-Kun, but not the others? And please be specific.
These two cases were being looked at to be used as a pretext for major military movement, and my fear was a repeat of the deployment of another 500,000 soldiers like we saw in Iraq towards what was the Obama administration's goal, which was regime change in Syria.
Now, in this case, Colonel Gabbard was relying on the testimony of Ted Postel, who appears as a commentator on the Russian state-sponsored media outlet RT, or Russia Today. And what Senator Kelly says afterwards is kind of interesting. Again, I'm going to play the whole thing.
When we began this, you described a thoughtful approach to analyzing intelligence and reaching conclusions. This is what we expect of our professionals. But we just kind of walked through how you came to question Assad's use of chemical weapons in these two cases with a different approach. And I don't reject seeking out differing viewpoints. We need to do that. But you started from a place of doubting the conclusions of the U.S. intelligence community, and then you sought out information that confirmed your viewpoint. That led you to embrace the opinions of two individuals that I think we disagree on this. You think they had expertise, I do not, and others do not. But these individuals were sympathetic to Russia and the Assad regime. It also led you to minimize or discount the overwhelmingly information that contradicted your viewpoint, including the expert assessments of our own intelligence community. And they don't get it right 100% of the time. I get that. But what I have seen makes it clear that at the same time that you were skeptical of our intelligence community's assessments, you would not apply the same skepticism to information that came from sympathizers of Russia and Assad. And I think that's something that we should all be concerned about.
Now, I want to end this with a question from Senator Kristen Gillibrand about TikTok, which is a topic that is near and dear to my heart.
Your past statements have essentially said that requiring domestic ownership of TikTok is a violation of civil liberties, and the national security concerns are complete BS. Can you explain why you have this view on TikTok?
The position that I previously made, obviously not as a member of Congress, as you consider the TikTok legislation, were centered around the protection of Americans' First Amendment rights and the lack of data privacy legislation, frankly, that would apply to TikTok, Facebook, X, all of these different social media applications that collect on us as users of these applications.
Now, this really scares me. I've said before that TikTok is a weapons platform that is used by China for infodom war, information domain warfare. Yes, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok all collect user data, but Facebook and Instagram are owned by an American company. And the difference is that leaders of Meta can be subpoenaed to appear before Congress to testify as to why they allowed Chinese infodom war on their platforms. And some of these operations do have kinetic effects. For example, Iranian infodom war convinced college students to glue themselves to the side of the MV Cape Orlando in the port of Oakland because they thought it held weapons going to Israel. Now, apparently none of these people looked at a map, because if you're going to Israel, you would leave from the Atlantic, not the Pacific, but there is a reason why we call these people useful idiots. And when it comes to China, they will use TikTok to tell American college students to stand in front of army convoys because Taiwan has always been Chinese and America's capitalists just want to exploit the working class. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. We can try to subpoena the chairman of ByteDance. Good luck with that. So the fact that Colonel Gabbard doesn't understand infodom war and why TikTok needs to remain in Chinese hands for their invasion of Taiwan to work, it's kind of the most troubling aspect of the hearing for me. The Russian talking points are kind of understandable. It makes a good podcast guest. I get it. But the lack of awareness regarding information domain warfare, that's kind of what scares me. So is Colonel Gabbard qualified to be the Director of National Intelligence? Well, Colonel Gabbard has experience in military operations, undoubtedly. She doesn't seem to have the intelligence background of her predecessors. But if previous precedents are taken into account, she has a 95% chance of being confirmed. And if you want to support the channel, grab one of my Intel Life hoodies from Bunker Branding, Control-C, Control-V, because that's really what we do. You can also grab a copy of my novel, The Wind Machine, which is available as a signed copy on Bunker Branding, or you can go to Amazon if you want to buy it a little bit cheaper, and Audible if you're a Marine and need an audiobook. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Hey everyone! New Ryan Macbeth t-shirts and hoodies from Bunker Branding are available. I'm gonna get the HIMARS shirt. What are you gonna get, Donald? The Patriot shirt, because I'm a patriot. It's the best shirt, the biggest shirt. Make 14 tangos great again. What are you gonna get, Barack? Let me be clear. I'm gonna get a Drone Sweet Drone shirt. What about you, George?
I'm going to get a Try That Missile shirt because they're weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, I'm going to get a Landmine Marker shirt because my presidency always blew up in my face.
I'll tell you what I'm going to get.
Ronald Reagan, but you're dead.
I came back to tell you that no matter our politics, we're all Americans. And we should buy Ryan's hoodies and t-shirts because they pay for the stock footage and licenses that allow him to make awesome content. So come on down to Bunker Branding and buy a Ryan Macbeth t-shirt or I'll start the bombing in 5 minutes.